This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hi, I'm Blake Chastain, and this is Powers and Principalities. This show focuses on the systems and institutions that prop up white evangelical power and influence in America and the world. Season 1 is focused on white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. This is episode 2. My guest for this episode is Kristin Kobus-Dumais. Kristin is the author of the new book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Through this book, Kristin chronicles how the ideals of white evangelicalism were formed as much by an idealized and valorized sense of so-called masculinity as it was by any theological commitment to God. By using this lens to trace the development of white evangelicalism, we see how white evangelical support for Trump is not an aberration or political compromise, but rather a culmination of a decades-long trend toward more and more militancy and hardline far-right stances, even within popular evangelical thought. This history goes back further than one expects, not just to John Wayne, but to turn-of-the-century figures like Teddy Roosevelt and the popular evangelist Billy Sunday. Reading Ms. Dumais' book was an unexpectedly emotional experience for me, and maybe for other men and women who grew up in white evangelicalism as well. You can find Jesus and John Wayne at your local bookstore and on Amazon, and you can help support the show by purchasing it using one of the links in the show notes. Now let's get to my conversation with Kristin Kobus-Dumais. My guest today is Kristin Kobus-Dumais, professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University and author of the new book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Welcome to the show, Kristin.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining me. I have to be honest at the very top of this interview. Your book was unexpectedly a little difficult to read because it just really ended up bringing up a lot of sort of intensely personal things that I didn't realize because I could sort of see them in the lives of myself and the other men in my life. However, that might sort of inform some of the questions I ask as well as just the tenor of this interview. But I do want to start by really with the title of your book, which is Jesus and John Wayne. It actually sort of accomplishes two things simultaneously, which is that it grounds your narrative in the historical roots that go back farther than a lot of people expect, and also makes this sort of jarring comparison explicit. So let's start there. How does John Wayne, and even before that, people like Teddy Roosevelt, relate to the early development of evangelical masculine identity?
Yeah, and I'd say it does even one more thing, which is, pointing to the popular culture significance as part of my story and understanding evangelicalism itself as a culture. So I did not set out to write a book about John Wayne at all. But as I was looking at this vast evangelical literature on masculinity, I kept seeing John Wayne pop up as, we all know John Wayne is the icon of Christian manhood. And so I started to take that seriously. And, first it was significant to me that so many of the heroes that they looked to as models of Christian manhood were not Christian men themselves, or certainly not deeply religious men themselves. They had not been formed by Christian values, traditionally speaking, such as the fruits of the Spirit, right? That to get this kind of rugged, tough, masculine, militant ideal, you kind of had to go outside of the faith. And so, John Wayne is this perfect example. And he becomes the icon of conservative American manhood in the 60s and 70s in particular. at this critical moment in American cultural history, political history, and in the history of American evangelicalism. So he comes to symbolize kind of an antidote to feminism, to the modern civil rights movement, to the anti-war movement. He stands for this nostalgic America, Christian America, with all his toughness. And so that's really what I saw influencing uh, contemporary evangelical understandings of quote unquote biblical masculinity. They weren't looking to the Bible very much, but to pop culture icons in this tradition.
Yeah, so talk about that a little bit and how that and is a study in contrast, as well as for as much as communities such as white evangelicalism talks about the biblical narrative or biblical Christianity or using biblical as a sort of frame, how things like the life of John Wayne differ drastically from the life exhibited in the Jesus of the Gospels.
Yeah. So, and it's not just John Wayne. I'll throw that in. Mel Gibson's William Wallace from Braveheart it certainly
Mm-hmm.
rivals John Wayne in terms of, the frequency with which evangelicals writers. You're right. When evangelicals talk about themselves, they are very quick to self identify as Bible believing Christians. And when evangelical leaders and evangelical scholars talk about, what's the essence of evangelicalism, they will point to theological categories, a kind of theological rubric. The authority of the Bible is right up there. The atonement of Christ, conversionism, right? These kind of, you check these boxes and then they'll say, okay, you're an evangelical. But I think that really misses the reality that for many evangelicals, I mean, we know that many evangelicals are just theologically illiterate. Frankly, surveys bear that out. But evangelicalism is a set of cultural values as much as anything, and so I really wanted to approach evangelicalism as a cultural movement, and white evangelicalism in particular. So again, if you argue that evangelicalism is simply a kind of theological rubric, then you can count global quote unquote evangelicals. Most Black Protestants in America get thrown into that bucket. But in terms of lived experience, that's inaccurate, right? We know that the white evangelical tradition has developed historically and culturally and politically largely distinct from Black Protestantism in America. And so even when they're talking about the Bible, what they mean by different passages, which passages they even bother to look to, are really quite different. What they mean by Jesus is quite different, and many white evangelicals have transformed Jesus uh, into a kind of warrior, a warrior Christ, and a militant model. And so for me, I came to see, for all their talk of being Bible believing and the authority of the Bible, uh, their understanding and encounter of the scriptures was very much shaped by these cultural ideals rather than the other way around.
Mm-hmm. So what about that and these cultural ideals? Your book is about masculinity in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Let's try to define that really, and what you mean when you appeal and you're discussing through your book what evangelical masculinity is and what they are trying to emulate and what they're trying to capture, and that what you do throughout the book is you provide evidence for how that has shifted over time, but nonetheless, these same people, and this is the culture that I come from, so I do have that lived experience of knowing how this is
Mm-hmm.
been presented to these communities
Yeah.
in a sort of insular way and how they speak when they're within those communities. But for a broader audience,
Yeah.
what does evangelical masculinity, what is it aspiring to? And through the earlier parts of your book, what were they trying to, what were they reacting to or what were they responding to within the culture?
Mhm. So, first, I'll say that I'm talking about evangelical masculinity, but a particular strain, and the connection between evangelical masculinity and militarism, and that's really the thread that I wanted to follow. Now, when I started, really putting this book together and was shopping the proposal around to different editors, one editor, when we were talking about it, said, "What you really have here, Kristin, is a new history of evangelicalism." And I really pushed back. I thought, no. This is much more modest. I'm really just trying to tell the story of white evangelical masculinity and militarism, and then see where that gets us. And I ended up working with a different publisher, and it was about 2 or 3 months later, and I was really wrestling with a chapter early in the book, and it suddenly dawned on me in that moment. I'm writing a new history of evangelicalism. And so I eventually did follow up with the editor and say, yeah, sorry, you were kind of right. And he was very gracious. But what I mean by that is that when you start looking at masculinity, it's really one facet of this larger ideology, right? It's
Hmm.
just one piece, and it's intricately connected to Christian nationalism, right, to their cultural identity, to their politics. But it's just really kind of one angle that you can take, but a very important one. So what I discovered in just following this trail of evangelical masculinity and kind of seeing how it emerged in the 1960s and 1970s in particular, and how it helped shape this emerging coalescing evangelical identity. And right when we see the rise of the religious right and evangelicals not becoming political for the first time, but the kind of partisan political mobilization that we recognize today,
Hmm.
um, right? At that point, they cared deeply about, as they put it, gender difference. That was just this fundamental truth. To be a Christian meant defending gender difference. So for men, that looked like leadership, right? Patriarchal leadership. And what was so interesting to me was they weren't just talking about leadership in the family, although that was very important. All of their books, sermons, right? They would very quickly make the leap to, we need strong men in the family to lead the family and to lead the church and to defend the nation against communism, against all of these evil external threats. And so
Hmm.
family and nation were intimately connected, and they always have been. So part of what this is doing is simply, refusing to separate family values evangelicalism as something kind of private, personal, and the political engagement of evangelicals, not just on family values issues. Because I think in the end, gender is so personal, and it affects people in their day-to-day lives. And so many evangelicals spend a lot of time thinking about it. Women, what does it mean to be a Christian woman? You have women's Bible studies, all kinds of literature. And this really does form people, and it shapes their political identities and their political allegiances.
Hmm. Absolutely. And the thing that was very interesting in regards to your book is how early that seems to have formed. And one of the things that I think a lot of people, even that come from evangelicalism, whether it's been in the last 30 to 50 years, the general understanding or the sort of accepted myth is that this movement appeared almost ex nihilo after Roe v. Wade. That all of a sudden this movement was birthed in response to the injustice of abortion access and abortion becoming legal. That is demonstrably not the case, based on the historical record, as indicated in your book and many others. But to me, it's such an interesting thing to read a book like yours and try to understand why the 50s and 60s and 70s were such a critical time for these understandings. Like one historian, Stephanie Kuntz, who's written about like the history of marriage, posits that moment in the 50s of men being the primary breadwinner and all of those things was essentially a historical aberration. It wasn't the case in the majority of the history in Western Europe, and most other parts of the world. But evangelicals sort of sought to make that model like immutable and eternal. Was it just because these people in the 50s and 60s felt the political and social power of white men beginning to wane?
Yeah, well, first I would say, I mean, it's absolutely critical just to understand that, yes, the kind of 50s gender roles, which have been branded traditional, were an aberration. And that as a historian, you can just see so much change over time. You know, if you, even just in American history, which is a relatively brief swath of history generally, that you see that ideas of gender and labor and economics that just are very much in flux in throughout history. And so I think that, I mean, one of the things that a historical study of gender does quite simply is it demonstrates that things have not always been the way they are now. And for evangelicals in particular, that can be really startling because evangelicals tend to talk about gender in very static categories, that, you know, things traditional, things have always been this way. This is, you know, God ordained gender roles. When what,
Mhm.
you know, those are always, in fact, very, very historically and culturally contingent. But evangelicals have been very good at, you know, kind of um, uh, holding up this largely mythical ideal, which is loosely based on a kind of mythical understanding of white middle class Victorian past, and this little moment in the 1950s where the male breadwinner was a viable model, in large part, frankly, because of you know, federal government spending, the
Mhm.
GI Bill, and you know, this post-war economic boom. It worked for a very short time. So then the problem is when you kind of reify that as traditional God-given gender roles, when the economic underpinnings of that begin to shift, as they certainly do by the 1970s, then, you know, where does that leave you if you've already dictated that that is, you know, God ordained? Not to mention the fact that those gender arrangements were only ever available to a very small subset of the American population, and, you know, and only, frankly, to white people of certain means. So yeah, history can just show how this is very contingent, and I think that's the first important step for evangelicals to understand, that, you know, to ask what does it mean to be a faithful man, faithful woman, is going to change in light of the changes in history.
Mm. Right. Absolutely. What your book really highlights is the different male leaders that really stewarded or guided or shaped. Those might be benevolent terms for the sorts of impacts that they've had that have been largely negative and deleterious for a lot of society. I'd like to talk about some of them in particular and how they have helped to shape this part of white evangelicalism. And I want to start with Billy Graham. His influence starts very early in sort of the mid-century period, and then continues up until very recently. He just recently passed within the last few years, and his son, for better or worse, has taken up his mantle, in a much more partisan way than his father ever did, or at least that he tried to signal on a more public scale. So Billy Graham, how did his presentation of being a Christian man influence the Christian leaders that came after him?
Yeah, and this is, you know, for those of us, I'll call us younger, it's all relative,
Right.
you know, who have more of a memory of Graham in his waning years. I think there are some surprises in this book because we tend to think of Graham as this grandfatherly type, really quite mellow, not all that political, really, you know, the pastor to the presidents, regardless of party, and just as this kind of figure of American Christianity. But if you go back in time, the 40s, 50s, 60s, he's a firebrand. He's very, very political. And I mean, and very much grasping for power, political power. And, you know, and now I better say this, even as he was, really trying to spread, the gospel as he understood it. This wasn't just his evangelism was not just a cover for his political, quest for power, but they went hand in hand. And what struck me going back is, how one of his biographers has pointed this out that it's hard to find a newspaper account of Graham for 2 or 3 decades that doesn't talk about his masculine appearance and his square jaw and his steely blue eyes. And that's not the Graham that we tend to think of today in our memory. But he really was this model of rugged masculinity, and that was important to him, and it was important to evangelicals who in the post-war era were really trying to reclaim what they perceived as kind of lost social standing, that they felt that they had been marginalized. And so when they come together in the 1940s to form the National Association of Evangelicals, they have very clear plans to reclaim that power and to move into the media, into education, into politics, to really claim America again, for God. And they believed that that their Christianity was the truest form of Christianity, and so it was really up to them to re-Christianize America and to keep America strong. And they felt this kind of huge burden. And Billy Graham was right at the center of that. And so the fact that he was this masculine man, that he could hold his own, that he was very quickly a celebrity, just completely worked into their plans in terms of making evangelicalism not just respectable again, but really quite powerful again.
And what you touched on there was that during this period, back when the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, was created, there was an intent to move into things like media and education and politics.
Yeah.
Each of those is very important in sort of how modern evangelicalism was formed, and I'd like to try and tackle those in different ways. With regard to media, what role did the development of alternative media ecosystems play in propagating these views of evangelical masculinity? In like the 1920s, following things like the Scopes trial, you had the development and the establishment of certain colleges, like my alma mater, Indiana Wesleyan. It was established in 1920. Then eventually you have things like publishing houses, and then in the 80s through the 2000s, then entire places like the Christian bookstore I worked for in high school,
Yes.
that continued to have this influence of allowing someone to exist within a particular type of information sphere. We talk about filters, we talk about all those things now around media environments. But what did that role play in continuing the sorts of things that Billy Graham started? He was a mass media maven in a lot of ways. He really did that very successfully. How did the people that followed in his footsteps build upon that?
I mean, this was hugely important. It really can't be underestimated how important the Christian media empire, Christian publishing is to the story that I tell, and frankly, to the last half century of American evangelicalism, or I guess we're more than a half century away from that now. Um, and I mean, in so many ways, one thing, a lot of conservative Christians were really preaching this us versus them mentality, and you really can't trust people outside our circles. You can't trust media sources outside of our circles. And I mean, you can trace that through kind of presuppositionalism if you want to get theological and technical. But just more generally, the idea that, we hold God's truth, and therefore, why would you go outside of our circles? Because they don't have access to the truth that we have. And so there's a lot of control on the messaging. And then you just have this like kind of explosion of popular culture in the post-war era, and in Christian publishing in particular. And here I learned a lot from historian Daniel Silliman, I use his work in Jesus and John Wayne, and he has demonstrated how the rise of the CBA, Christian Booksellers Association, is actually really critical because earlier in the century, a lot of Christian publishing was distributed through denominations and through, that was the distribution network. And then by mid-century with the CBA, you have the ability to market your Christian publishing across denominations and outside of denominations. And since evangelicalism was never bounded by denominations anyway, this is really critical. But the problem then was that, whereas earlier in the century, you could have some very kind of specific doctrinal writings and specific to the denominations that they were intended to reach. You'll get very quickly into trouble if you try to do that across kind of theological differences, in terms of premillennialism, postmillennialism, or this view of baptism or that view of baptism. You can get into trouble. So to have the widest appeal, the market was really for works that avoided those particulars because they would have a niche market, and instead focus on things like Christian living, gender, right? How to be a Christian parent, how to be a Christian woman, how to be a Christian man. And these are going to have this broad appeal. And that really starts to define not just the evangelical market, but to define really what evangelicalism means to many evangelicals themselves. So they're going to be listening to Dobson's Focus on the Family. They're going to be reading books on raising your children and really identifying around this kind of Christian living literature more than specific doctrines, specific theology. And so the market itself and distribution methods end up kind of changing evangelicalism itself. And you talked about Christian bookstores, and hugely important in terms of I used to go into Christian bookstores. Sadly, most of them have closed due to broader economic shifts. But just to kind of take the pulse of the evangelical world, what am I seeing on the shelves? What's not on these shelves? And I think for many evangelicals, that popular culture has been incredibly formative to what's properly Christian and what is secular, what is outside of kind of this truth.
After the 2008 recession, I went at one point. I had a part-time job at on Moody Bible Institute's Lifeway bookstore, which was run by Lifeway, and I at one point was tasked with removing Rob Bell's books after he published Love Wins.
Yes.
So
exactly.
In a broader conversation about, if we were talking about cancel culture, we could certainly bring up how evangelicals have employed that for a very long time. Within those sorts of frameworks, but that is
no, we could, and actually we probably should. But this is really what I was grappling with. So what is evangelicalism? And it's a consumer culture in many ways. It's a culture formed, through this consumer culture, and now we have this newfangled word, cancel culture. I just talk about boundaries. Who gets to define those boundaries? And it's more complicated if you don't have a kind of institutional hierarchy, but no less powerful. In fact, I would say even more powerful. So exactly whose books are distributed, whose books are on the shelves, and which ones are not, and what factors, where are the lines that you cross. And what I discovered is you can be very racist and not be defined outside of respectable evangelicalism. Your books are still going to be carried. But if you cross the line on LGBTQ, obviously, right, you're going to be on the outs. And so I became fascinated in kind of trying to map out this evangelicalism through networks, alliances, and then also understand power. Who has the power to define who's in and who's out, and then to carry that out? And that was just a fascinating part of the project for me.
What are some examples of that? In particular, the ways in which someone can voice racist opinions but cannot voice opinions that are supportive or affirming of queer people, of LGBTQ
Yes.
people. What are some examples of that within the evangelical literature?
So if you look at homeschool literature, if you look at works by people like Doug Wilson, for example, you can see some really racist interpretations of the Civil War. Slavery was this wonderful system, and Black people were very happy in their enslaved status, and it was all very tranquil and orderly. And that if you look at homeschool history teachings, for example, this is a very common motif, and Wilson has written a couple of books that suggest as much as well. And then you can say, okay, is this fringe? We're talking homeschool. We're talking, Doug Wilson, a particularly cantankerous figure. But then what I do in the book is I demonstrate how these ideas and these figures become quite mainstream as homeschool becomes much more popular, and the homeschool movement begins to influence outside of homeschool circles. But somebody like Doug Wilson, you have John Piper coming out and vouching for him and inviting him into his orbit of influence and saying, "Oh, I promise you, I know from the bottom of my heart that Doug Wilson is not a racist." And so one of the things, another of the things that I really worked was to try to figure out, what is actually fringe here within white evangelicalism, and what is mainstream, and what is the relationship between the two? Because it's tempting, I think, for quote unquote respectable evangelicals to very quickly separate themselves out. And anybody who says something that's offensive or deeply problematic, you just say, "Oh, that's not who we are." When in fact, you can see that mainstream evangelicalism and evangelical leaders have been deeply complicit in things that we might want to claim are actually fringe.
Right. Absolutely. And we've definitely seen that in the last few years, the Trump administration and the protestations that people have around, instead of no true Scotsman, it's no true evangelical type
Yes.
arguments, whether it's based on something, arcane or only known to people who've done readings about the Bennington Quadrilateral or something else, to whatever it might be. It's very different than the cultural evangelicalism, which you are primarily investigating through your book.
Yes.
There's so much to go into there, and I think we'll get there. What I do want to touch on, you mentioned homeschool, and I think that brings to mind the way in which homeschool ties, and a lot of the leaders tie these beliefs about quote traditional or biblical gender roles to both family dynamics, including spouse relationships, as well as parenting dynamics, to both family and education. So, what were the ways in which these ideas of evangelical masculinity, which we may have mentioned the term once so far, but really are couched in patriarchal ideas? Let's do a little bit of definition of terms, because I think that's helpful for this type of audience who may have some exposure to this, but may also not. So let's try to define some terms as we go. But how does the homeschool leaders like Bill Gothard and James Dobson, who crosses into a lot of media and politics, how do those figures start to develop the groundwork in the 70s for what follows later?
Yeah, so this kind of patriarchy, essentially the idea of male leadership or male headship. They'll say so that the man is the head of the family, and drawing on particular biblical passages and particular interpretations of those passages. But it's not just about kind of ultimate authority. There's a whole set of values that go along with this for men and for women. And the kind of more contemporary iteration of this is complementarianism, which again, it's all about gender difference. And conservative evangelicals will say that complementarianism is not about power differentials, that it's a kind of separate but equal kind of thing where, yes, men are leaders, but women are equally as valuable, but they just have different roles. And so what that looks like for women is submission to male authority, But it also usually means, a very feminine role, as they define it. So this hyper femininity and emphasis on beauty, and emphasis on being a real support to your husband, again, through submitting to his leadership, which builds him up as a masculine leader, and also sexually, being sexually submissive and sexually responsive and alluring to a man, because God made man with pretty intense sex drives because he filled them with testosterone. And so it really is the wife's obligation to meet all of those needs. Otherwise, bad things will happen. And if bad things happen, it's clearly the wife's fault for not having met those needs. So there's this kind of whole package of values that go along with gender difference and ideas of masculine leadership and female submission. And yes, kind of how that takes shape in the 1970s, with people like Gothard, and Gothard would be really quite extreme, but he really stresses the importance of authority,
Mm-hmm.
of properly ordered authority. And that is essential to the church, it is essential to the social order. And he's looking around in the 60s and 70s, and the real problem to him is a breakdown of authority. And for him, that authority is very, very clear. It's God, pastor, father, wife, and children. And so that's the authority structure that he will maintain. And he also has employer employee is part of this as well. So it fits nice with kind of free market capitalism and
Mm-hmm.
anti-communism and all these kinds of things. It comes together, but it's all about authority. And that authority was extreme, unquestioned. So a wife needed to ask her husband's permission for what groceries to get, how she should cut her hair, those sorts of things. So very extreme authoritarianism in the home and in society. And of course, white Christian men were at the top, beneath God. And as representatives of God's authority. Now, again, that sounds quite horrific and extreme. And initially, I was going to keep Gothard out of this book because, again, I thought, nope, fringe guy. And so many people that I talked to who have come through white evangelicalism in one way or another said, no, you have to look at Gothard. His influence was so significant, but beneath the surface. And it's true. So many people I talked to, their parents were influenced by Gothard's teachings.
Mm-hmm.
Then you look at somebody like James Dobson, and he is saying very similar things. Dare to discipline, it's all about asserting authority, and asserting authority in the face of the disruption of the 1960s, of protesters, of your anti-war activists. And so this asserting authority in the home, and it's a gendered authority, hierarchical authority, is absolutely critical for the sake of the nation. Again, and when it really came down to it, the difference is in degrees, not really in substance, between somebody like Gothard and somebody like Dobson.
Mm-hmm. And Dobson emerges as someone that bridges the divide between these private matters
Yes.
of family and the more political aspirations of people within, that becomes the religious right, that becomes the moral majority. Within that period when Dobson and Gothard are beginning to publish, they start to build political alliances as their stars rise, whether that's through the media or otherwise. Is it wrong to say that this is when things start to become more militaristic and more seeking basically dominance and power within the political and social sphere?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the 70s are a critical period, the 60s, late 60s and 70s. And, a lot of people will point to Roe v. Wade, and evangelicals themselves will, and it did play a role. But I just kept being struck by how profound an influence the Vietnam War was
Mm-hmm.
in kind of inflaming this militancy and separating evangelicals out from most other Americans and uniting them with secular conservatives, frankly. And I just think that's such a critical moment. And what was striking in these books on evangelical masculinity that I was reading well through the 1990s, Vietnam remained a touchstone. Like the most popular books in the 1990s opened with scenes from Vietnam and, soldiers in Vietnam. And this was like the moment in American history when things started to unravel. And this is when then white evangelicals really start to embrace an identity that's clearly in opposition to many other Americans, to liberals, to anti-war activists, or even to Americans who are just ambivalent about the war. We had told ourselves these myths of, we fight good wars and we have, American power and we win wars. And Vietnam started to unravel those myths. But with the white evangelical community, they doubled down on those. And Billy Graham is right at the heart of this, right? And they start to define patriotism as being pro-war, pro-American power. And they link that very tightly in the Cold War context to Christian power and to their own power. And again, when they see the rest of the country really starting to express doubts for obvious reasons, that's when they think that they have they are God's chosen people. They are the faithful remnant. And it is up to them to kind of make America great again, right? And to keep America going. And so, I think the 70s are really important. Vietnam is critical. The civil rights movement is playing a role here as well, particularly for Southern evangelicals. So you can look at things like, Randy Ballmer has written on the role of, private schools and segregation academies and helping to mobilize the religious right. And they will use family values language, talking about, the rights of parents. What we know that really means fathers, to make decisions for their kids without the interference of the federal government. Well, in that time and place, we're talking about anti-integrationism. And so, all of these factors come together in the 1960s and 1970s and do really define the cultural and political identity of evangelicals. And they are able to help shape the Republican Party, because this is right when we have the party realignments taking place. And it's not just that Republicans kind of shift to this conservatism that we recognize today, and then evangelicals find them, but evangelicals are there on the ground floor making this happen as well.
It's within that period, within the 70s and 80s and everything that spins out of that evangelicals move very strongly to identify with the Republican Party and pin all of their hopes on this party as the one that will be the banner holders for their concerns. What was also striking, and what I didn't really expect when I was reading your book, was the elements in regards to the Promise Keepers in the 80s, and then how that sort of fed into a variety of different things within the 90s, because each one of these phases builds one upon the other.
Yeah.
So one of the things that was popular then was this idea of the tender warrior, this idea of men as people that were very testosterone laden and aggressive, and somehow that has something to do with Jesus. This homeless Palestinian that gave away free healthcare. Nonetheless, like that sort of was a precursor to what I, in the late 90s, experienced as like John Eldridge's book, which you do also talk about, Wild at Heart, and Sacred Romance was his other book that was also very popular and really served to try to romanticize this relationship of being very defined, very particularly male, but then how that was defined was very much in relation to how women and other people related to you. So I know that's a long preamble here because I got sidetracked by all that prognostication and everything. Sorry about that. Nonetheless, what did that enable, and how did that begin to Promise Keepers and the people that came from trying to use this warrior language affect the way men understood themselves?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, in the 1990s, that's when the evangelical men's movement really kind of came into attracted national attention, right? The March in Washington, and you have, feminists saying this is a really bad thing. This is, we need to fight this, and these are sexist and misogynist, and if you look at the Promise Keepers movement, it's actually there's no one message. It's self-contradictory. It's this interesting moment because the Cold War has come to an end, right? And so in the early 90s, there's a lot of the word that I came across all the time was confusion. What does it mean to be a man in this moment? It seemed like, feminism, to them at least, seemed like it was here to stay. Broader economic changes, women are in the workplace. That's not going to change. The old, like, super sexist misogyny, out of style. You can't do that. So there was a real sense among evangelical men, too, that we can't kind of revive the old macho masculinity. We need something new. And it was very conflicted. There are actually some rather egalitarian representations of gender within Promise Keepers, and there are very reactionary ones. And they're kind of held together by this idea of soft patriarchy, just be nice about it. And the tender warrior. So you gotta fight, but you also can be tender. And I mean, this kind of makes no sense, but it's a way that they were able to hold together these tensions. What I see happening by the end of the 1990s is a real backlash against this tenderness, and you probably remember that too. The emotional intensity of these Promise Keepers rallies initially was a sign of God's presence. And then within a couple of years, it was kind of an embarrassment and something that, real men wanted to keep far away from. And so you kind of see this by the late 90s, 97, 99, 2001. It comes into fruition, a return to the testosterone because, to use one of their quotes, in the trenches, you don't want tenderness. And so we already have that backlash in full swing. So we have in 2001, James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, back to you got to train them up to be rough and tough. Boys will be boys. You have Wild at Heart, the Every Man Needs a Battle to Fight and a Beauty to Rescue. And you have Doug Wilson's Future Men. And all of those books are on the shelves of Christian bookstores when 9/11 happens. And that just kicks this into high gear because then it's obvious to everyone within evangelicalism and beyond that what America needed in that moment wasn't the soft masculinity, wasn't the feminist kind of, stripping away of the toughness, the ruggedness of American men. What we needed was, John Wayne riding across the plains, as they say, ready to fight our enemies. And so you see that happening within evangelical circles before 9/11, but that just really amps it up. And that's when we get into the Mark Driscoll chapter of this really blatantly and brazenly militant masculinity that is unapologetically misogynistic, hypersexual, and incredibly disturbing if you actually pay attention to it.
Yeah, to give context to that, he was the pastor of Mars Hill Church in Seattle, not the Mars Hill Church that Rob Bell was a part of in Michigan. And he was part of the New Calvinists or the Young, Restless, and Reformed
Yes.
movement that really tried to instill this in-your-face bro Christianity that was unapologetically offensive in a lot of ways. And he would often do things like he had a vision of some woman having an affair, like in explicit detail from the pulpit, and would be very, very vulgar. And what else about him is emblematic of that 2000s era that runs before Obama's tenure? And a lot of this can be tied to different administrations and the ways in which evangelicals respond to national politics in general.
Mm-hmm.
But how did this really start to inform men's own understanding of themselves and manliness as an evangelical in that era?
Yeah, I mean, so for the first thing to recognize is Driscoll, with all of his extremes, and by this point in the book, you see he is standing in a long line of, this sort of teaching. Yes, he takes it a bit to an extreme, but the patterns are already set. This rugged, even crass masculinity, and especially the need for women to submit to masculine authority and to sexually please their husbands, with whatever their needs. And so this cross sexuality is shocking if you don't know that history. But it was very it was widespread, in part because, like you say, Driscoll really mastered kind of the internet at an early stage, and he became really influential. Not just his ideas, his teachings on masculinity and his militarism, but also simply because he was succeeding. And a lot of the evangelical pastors wanted to emulate that success and to grow churches and grow networks, and they wanted in on it. And so he was on this kind of pedestal of, this guy knows how to do it. So this militant masculinity was linked to his evangelistic success, and just his ability to really establish this religious empire relatively quickly. And so, in terms of how men experience this, as I researched this book and as I talked to lots of men, even men who wouldn't necessarily articulate it in this way, I started to realize that the vast majority of Christian men can't live up to this ideal. And at any given point in time, they weren't living up to this ideal. They might for a weekend go on a wild at heart retreat and pretend to climb a mountain, but then they're back wearing their khakis and their polo shirts, and they're sitting in a Bible study, for goodness sake. Uh, which isn't to say that they didn't embrace this aspirationally. And I think what you have then is a lot of men feeling, if they couldn't live up to this impossible ideal, that they were somehow kind of second class Christians, and second class men, and that they should step out of the way and let the alpha males really take charge, as the alpha males like Driscoll were telling them to do. And so it's not that every man became this wild man, but that was kind of the ideal held up. The true Christian man is going to look like this. And if you're falling short, well, you should be a follower then of this guy, and try to toughen yourself up as much as possible. And so many of the men that I talked to really ended up feeling either empowered by this, because they'd read something like Aldridge, or they'd listen to Driscoll, and they'd be, there's a quote in the book where it's like, I was a nobody. I didn't have any particular talents. I was, as a young white Christian guy, but I would listen to this, and I would feel empowered, because I would feel like, he's telling me that, I'm a leader and I'm a man and I can take charge. And it was empowering in that moment. For many others, it was incredibly disempowering and
Hmm.
discouraging, because they knew they weren't measuring up. But in some ways, it was easier to kind of support this by supporting the ideology, by supporting the leaders who seemed to embody this better than they did. And the books will tell them to do this. You can fight this battle, and maybe for you it looks like opening up your wallet and writing a check to the Family Research Council, and you can be part of this battle. And so there are
Right.
many ways to participate in this.
Hmm.
Some men ended up walking away entirely because they couldn't measure up, and others found ways to participate in this larger battle.
Hmm. That's incredibly telling, right? Because the people that may have been empowered or may have found a way to reconcile the things that made them uncomfortable, it still was a system in which their own empowerment was built upon the
Yeah,
diminishing others, people
absolutely.
that are not white men, because there is absolutely a racial aspect to all of this, and that's why your book is specific in talking about white evangelicals, and you do talk about how men who are not white did not have this similar experience, and then also earlier in our conversation you mentioned that this is very distinct from Black
Hmm.
Protestantism and other aspects of American Christianity. I certainly remember just again adding some personal flair to this. Like I remember my father going to things like Promise Keepers, and then having that literature around, and then later for me it was things like Wild at Heart and Mark Driscoll. But I personally sort of chafed at that, and it was largely because even though, to tie back to something you talked about before about how the media could reach across denominations, my family attended United Methodist Church, so the first pastors I knew were women, which is at odds with most conservative white evangelicalism, but evangelical teachings were able to reach me right there, and brought me into a more conservative place, despite that. I do want to try to bring the conversation closer to where we are now in 2020. We're talking in early August 2020 now. And in the 2000s, entering into the Obama administration, there was always a sense of grievance and a sense of feeling under attack and embattled that evangelicals have always used to their political advantage to vilify and otherize people that are not like them in the political sphere. And that accelerates during the Obama era and leads to a lot of the support for Trump. There's a sort of a study of contrast that happens there, because within the faith communities, there in the 2010s begins to be a bit of a reckoning. Things like the Church Tube movement, very specific investigations into abuse. A lot of the leaders of these very formative leaders, like Gothard, like Swaggart, like so many others, their own histories of abuse and of sexual abuse come to light. And yet, what we see, and I think the thing that binds, one of the things that binds white evangelicalism and Trumpism together is sort of this appeal to authority without accountability, and escaping accountability even when it doesn't meet its own standards. Even though people that know white evangelicalism may not be surprised by the fact that a lot of these leaders embraced this faux strongman in Trump, what can we learn from the ways in which these faith communities still sort of jockey for and struggle inherently with trying to hold these people that have guided their culture for decades accountable for things that they would condemn others for?
Yeah. So I had initially started to delve into this research more than 15 years ago, and then I set it aside for a couple of reasons. But I kept track of the guys who are promoting this very militant masculinity, and what I observed was one after another became implicated in sexual abuse scandals, either directly or indirectly by covering up what their friends were doing, and so I tracked this for a long time. And to me, things clicked in the week after the Access Hollywood tape release, where, with when Trump is on video, admitting to assaulting women, speaking in very crass ways, and evangelicals slightly waver for a few days. And then all of those who are supporting him are back supporting him again within a week or two. And that's when I realized, we have seen this before. We have seen this over and over again in evangelical churches, organizations, that the perpetrators are very quickly forgiven. The allegations are dismissed or outright denied, and victims are the ones who are blamed. And when that clicked for me, things started to make sense. And yeah, Trump was this authoritarian leader. He used the language very explicitly. I will protect Christianity. I will protect you. So he was this strong man, very much in keeping with this model of quote unquote Christian manhood, this very militant model of defensive, protective, aggressive masculinity, that where the ends would justify the means. And once you see it through that lens, then we don't really need to be talking about, this betrayal of evangelical values. That kind of language suggests that we don't really understand what those values ultimately were. If we just
Mm,
accept at
mhm,
face value family values and then interpret them in a way that what we think, they might mean, or moral values. But we have to understand that for decades, family values evangelicalism has always involved, really at its core, white patriarchal power and the militant assertion of that power when needed. And as soon as you locate that at the heart of family values evangelicalism, then we're not talking about a betrayal anymore when it comes to Trump.
mm. Yes, that's very astute and dead on, and it makes the contradiction of things, the seeming contradiction of things, make more sense. That is one thing that I think a lot of people do struggle with as they come up in these faith communities, as they decide whether to bring up their own families or to continue to participate in them themselves. One of the things that can often be at the heart of that sort of very difficult personal, what a lot of people call deconstruction. That's a very popular term for this type of experience, as they're sort of deconstructing and coming to terms with what they've been taught and whether they want to continue it on their own. One of the things they might see is the way in which men treat women, the way in which male power is sanctified and given a free pass for all manner of abuse. Where do you see that conversation going? And do you see these same leaders continuing to cling to their authority for as long as they can? Or do you see other signals of people continuing to wrestle with this
Yeah.
in 2020 and beyond?
It's so hard to predict the future, but I can say what I'm seeing right now. And I've been surprised at the reception of this book, even in just the first 6 weeks since it released. How many letters I've received, amazing, poignant letters from evangelicals, former evangelicals, um, who who have lived this life, have either extricated themselves or at the point of saying, this is not what I want, right? This is not what I meant. And I mean, one person said too, I bumped into a lot of these trees. I just never saw the forest until now, right? And I want no part of this. And so there's a lot of deconstruction that is ongoing that needs to continue, but the power structures are real. And I think we should not ignore that. That's an immense amount of power has gone into constructing this edifice, into creating those boundaries and enforcing those boundaries. And that extricating yourself is not just a personal kind of deconstructive process, but you're going to up against those power structures. You're going to have very strained relationships. And what I've been struck by is just how many people have been ill at ease with what they see in their own churches, in their own families, in their own communities, and have not dared to speak out. There's a lot of fear out there that evangelicals in powerful places, in organizations, institutions, um, do not feel that they can speak out honestly and openly at risk of losing their job, alienating family, and I just can't even say how many people have shared those fears with me. And so, in terms of what this moment demands, well, I'd say the first thing that if you find yourself in that position, you should know you're not alone, right? So many people are feeling this. As a historian, then I'll also say, and I'll just drop this here. My outside field in graduate school was 20th century Germany with a focus on Holocaust studies. And and my real interest was on the German Christian movement during 30s and 40s. And so, for all of the reasons to keep quiet, and there are many, and I think that has silenced many, many people in recent years or even recent decades. To really weigh what are the actual risks here? Are they discomfort? Are they, strained relationships for you personally? And what are the implications of maintaining that silence uh, outside of your own experience for others, for people who have been othered by this movement, even for the sake of American democracy at this point. And so I hope that people can be emboldened to start speaking out if they don't find that they're in agreement with this ideology, this belief system. And I think if more and more people start to do that, I'm really interested to see where things end up a few years from now.
Yeah, and I think your book does that in such a way that it's very central to a lot of people's concerns, a lot of people's. It frames things in a way that's absolutely necessary. There's a lot of literature and a lot of attention given to the abuse that women and other people in not in power in white evangelicalism have been abused and have been mistreated for decades. What I think your book does phenomenally well is illustrate the way in which the myth of white evangelical masculinity is so distant from, honestly, like, I don't usually talk in such sort of religious terms, but even the historical Jesus, even Jesus, as presented in the Gospels, is someone who says words like "the meek shall inherit the earth."
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
who in things like even an alpha male like Paul says that Jesus didn't consider equality with God something to be aspired for, and who elevated women through much of his ministry.
Yeah.
He got a little sassy with a couple of women, and that's not great. But he also spoke the longest theological conversation he has is with the woman at the well. And seeing that, studying contrasts is really important. And the thing that really struck me too, even seeing the ways in which people like my elders, like white boomer men, were subject to a lot of these same things that even they may not be aware that these massive intentional efforts to influence the way they understand their religion and the way they understand their gender, two key formative parts of your identity, were shaped by people with ulterior motives.
Exactly.
It's no small feat, and I'm glad that you put this book out there. I'm glad that it's being published when it is, and I want to thank you for writing the book and for taking some time to have this really broad conversation with me that just touches on so many aspects of how white evangelical Christianity was formed and what its goals and efforts have been in the service of over the past several decades. Where can people find the book? Where can they find you online? Plug away anything that you need to.
Sure.
Plug.
The book, it should be available at your local bookstore. And this is a really, really important time to support your local bookstore. So
Absolutely.
I would send you there. It's available pretty much everywhere books are sold or can be ordered very quickly. And in terms of finding me, I'm on Twitter at KKDumez, and that's Dumez. It doesn't, it's a strange name. Also Facebook, I have an author page, Kristin Dumez, and I'm very present on social media, and I have a website, kristindumez.com, where all of my writings are posted too. So I'm pretty much out there.
Well, Kristin, thank you so much for talking with me today about your work, and I hope people seek it out because it's very important. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that'll do it for this week's episode. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. The theme music is by Dave Lefevre and Jake Lewis. If you enjoyed this conversation, please rate and review Powers and Principalities on Apple Podcasts and let others know about the show. You can also support the show by purchasing Kristin's book from the link in the show notes and by signing up for a paid subscription to my newsletter, The Post Evangelical Post, at postevangelicalpost.com. Talk to you soon.